So before I invite Michelle Ford to the stage, our director, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. So it's now my pleasure to invite Professor Michelle Ford to the stage, who will be introducing our speakers. Thank you.
Okay, welcome. It's great to see you all here, and a special welcome to our student friends from high school. It's unusual for us to have so many students in the room, but it's great. You're most welcome. Please feel free to ask questions in the question time. Just before we start, for those of you who don't know, the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre is a university-wide multidisciplinary centre. We bring together academics and students from across the university, but also from across Australia and the region, together to think about the big issues that face Southeast Asia. Some key aspects of our work involve bringing a multidisciplinary approach to really big issues in economic and social development, environment, resources, health, heritage and the arts and state and society, but also creating opportunities where people can come together and learn from different perspectives about what they're studying. So in this room we might have veterinary scientists, we might have political scientists, we might have people who work on archaeology or sociology. Today is about learning a bit more about the context of the countries in which we are all interested or in which we all work. Today's first session, our two speakers will talk about recent political developments in Malaysia and Timor-Leste. Our first speaker is Ms. Tricia Yeoh. Tricia is doing a PhD at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus. In her day job, she's the Chief Operating Officer of the independent think tank IDEAS, the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, and she's currently taking a PhD in political science. Tricia has actively contributed to making national and state reforms within public policy areas related to anti-corruption, governance and accountability, natural resource transparency, economic freedom, public administration and education. She also previously worked for the Selangor State Government and was the director of the ASLI Centre for Public Policy Studies. So I'd like to welcome Tricia to the front. Tricia will speak for about 20 minutes. And then you will have an opportunity to ask some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for inviting me here to the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. It's a pleasure to be here this Friday morning. So as introduced, I'm Tricia from Malaysia. I have a public policy background, but today I'm going to be talking about the political developments in the country over the last year. So let's go straight into it. How do I? No, it's not working.
Keyboard.
Okay. Oh yeah. No. Okay. So for those who are not familiar with Malaysia, I'll just spend very quickly to provide an update of what happened. So last year, the government of Malaysia changed hands for the first time in over 50 years, for the first time since the country's independence. We had a change in regime, and the regime called BN UMNO was toppled. It was a surprising change of government, and I'm sure some of you who were here last year heard those updates. So just to give you a snapshot of where we are today. The new government is called Pakatan Harapan, and I'm going to refer to that as Pakatan the rest of my speech. It's made up of 4 different parties, and you don't need to remember the names of all the parties, but what you should remember is that it's a relatively new coalition in the sense that they had not worked together for very long. 3 out of the 4 parties had worked together, but the party with the flower and the red flag, Bersatu, was relatively new. So you're talking about a coalition that has not had significant experience cooperating. And then where are they today? So they won power last year with 113 seats in parliament. But since then, and because the country doesn't have an anti-party hopping law, the Pakatan coalition has benefited from people leaving from UMNO, and today they are just 9 seats short of a 2/3 majority in parliament. Now that's also important because it means that they can't pass certain laws through parliament that they had initially said they would, such as some institutional reforms. This is the Barisan coalition that fell. It's made up of three main parties that are ethnic based. So you've got the Malay Party, UMNO, MCA, and MIC. And where are they today? So from helming the federal government and many of the state governments in the past, today they're only relegated to two states, the small state of Perlis and Pahang on the peninsula. And I also want to talk about the opposition party of PAS. There are several, but the main one is the Islamic Party PAS. And why is this significant? Because they still own two states in the east coast of the peninsula, Kelantan and Terengganu. And more importantly, what happened post-election was that the Malay Party UMNO and the Islamic Party PAS decided to cooperate. So now they have taken an even narrower view of identity politics, taking a narrow view of Malay-Muslim identity politics that they feel will benefit them in the long run. In the last 3 out of the 4 by-elections, UMNO actually has won, and so they believe that this is the positioning that will benefit them in the long run. And interestingly enough, in the past, the Islamic Party PAS believed that UMNO was the enemy. And so we have anecdotal stories of some PAS voters actually crying when they had to vote for UMNO, because this was the instruction from the Islamic leader. They listened to their leaders under the concept of wala, and they essentially went to vote for UMNO, and that's why in the 3 out of the last 4 by-elections, they have won. So that's where we are today. So again, just to recap, 9th of May last year was when the government changed hands. Dr. Mahathir, the guy in the red jacket, the oldest prime minister in the world, is almost 94 years old, coming back to control the country in a very historic and unbelievable manner. He in fact said at the press conference when he came in that, please remember, ask your questions in an orderly manner. I was the dictator. And that caused a stir amongst the media. And it was the question on everyone's mind, is he going to behave the same way as he did in the past? In the first few months, he acted swiftly. He set up a council of eminent persons, a constitutional reforms committee, institutional reforms committee, and of course, this very telling visual imagery of going into Najib, the ex-prime minister's home, to take a lot of bags full of cash, jewelry, and luxury handbags worth millions of dollars. However, 1 year later, we have an opinion poll that has just come out from the Merdeka Center for Opinion Research, showing that the perception towards the federal government across ethnicity, particularly among the majority Malay ethnicity, has fallen quite drastically from 79% a year ago all the way down to 39% today. Why is this the case? What accounts for this despondency amongst the voters? I'm going to try and explain for this through 3 different themes, and then I'll talk about the future. So these are the 3 themes that I'm going to talk about in the short time I have today. So one of the first things that the Pakatan government did when they came into power was to abolish the GST, the Goods and Services Tax. This tax was perceived to be the cause of the increasing cost of living in Malaysia. And in fact, it was the campaign call throughout the country. They said repeatedly during the campaign that we are going to abolish the GST. That was done successfully. However, what the opposition did, meaning the UMNO and PAS did, was that they capitalized on this and said, you abolished the GST, but you brought a new tax in, which is the SST, the Sales and Service Tax. Now, as economists, we know that when you abolish the GST, some form of consumption tax would have come in. But what they did was they used this issue and they circulated posters, very crude, I'm sorry for this, but they said things like, kena kencing, which is that the government has, urinated on us, has backfired on its campaign promises. So it's losing the perception game. And of course, it's also a double whammy, because if you look at the charts, those were the projected revenues that the government would have received if it had continued with the GST. So it's lost some revenues, and it also comes at a difficult time when, number one, the government came in discovering that it had inherited a huge debt of over R1 trillion, and secondly, at a time when it has committed to doing populist policies that would be targeted at the bottom 40% of the population, bearing in mind that we still have very large segments of rural in especially East Malaysia. On the economy as well, in the poll that I cited earlier, more than 50% of them said that the cost of living was the most important issue that they're currently facing. So they still are concerned primarily with things like the loss of jobs, with wages not increasing fast enough. And even though we have pretty strong macroeconomic fundamentals, the perception is it's not filling the pockets and it's not trickling down fast enough. So in a sense, the new government has inherited something that they need to quickly turn around. So the government has had to turn to China yet again. In the previous regime, before Dr. Mahathir came back to power, he was constantly criticizing the deals that Najib had done with China, saying that these were grossly overpriced contracts, they were done without transparency, and even when they came into power, for many, many months, the contracts were suspended. So the analysts were trying to understand, are these contracts going to continue? What's going to be our relationship with China like? But in the context of the economy and the fiscal position of the country that I just mentioned earlier, in a sense, Mahathir has had to take that step forward and say that this is a relationship that we value. In the last few months, we have seen a 180-degree change. Mahathir has visited China. He's had a joint press conference with Xi Jinping. And the message that he's sending is Malaysia has accepted the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. It has renegotiated and relaunched new mega projects, one of which is this large-scale ECRL, the East Coast Rail Link, which is a huge rail project that's going to connect the east to the west coast of the peninsula, as well as another big project in Kuala Lumpur itself. And he's also said that, well, we are going to ensure that this relationship works because it comes at a time when the relationship with the US is also unstable and unpredictable. So that's on the economy. Now, if these contracts are true with which the government says it has saved the country, over 20 billion ringgit, there are some skeptics also who have said that perhaps are these contracts really saving the country money, or are they going to benefit the domestic economy? Some of the answers would be, it's okay to proceed with these projects as long as the issues of transparency and accountability and governance are taken care of, which is where I come to institutional reforms, which is also arguably one of the main reasons that the regime was toppled last year. The big case of 1MDB, as some of you have heard of and read about. Najib's trial, it is ongoing. Now, it's day 18 or 19 of one of the smaller trials within the bigger trial. But unfortunately, the delay caused some perception problems amongst those who were unfamiliar with the court's process. They were under the perception that if you're taking so long to charge him, does that mean that you don't have enough evidence leveled against him? So that was a little bit of a problem. Now the trial is ongoing, so that's positive. There are some anti-corruption initiatives, such as the National Anti-Corruption Plan that the government launched, but many of the things contained within the plan are going to take far too long to come to fruition, so 2023. And people are unsure as to whether the new leadership by then would still be committed to ensuring these reforms go through. So they're still quite slow, but present, and I think all members of the coalition are committed to this. But at the same time, the government has also continued to use some repressive laws that they said they would either repeal or amend. Some of them have been used against activists over the last year. And most importantly, the report of the Council of Eminent Persons that I mentioned earlier that was set up has been placed under the Official Secrets Act. So why is that the case? The OSA is a very outdated law. In fact, the government has been called to pass the Freedom of Information Act, which many countries around the world have adopted. And I think more importantly, the nexus of politics and business that UMNO so successfully used over its years in power is not resolved, and we don't see any sign of that unraveling anytime soon. The vice president of the party, Mahathir, belongs to Bersatu. In fact, at the party convention, made an unapologetic call for the government to give the party grassroots contracts, because he said the party has no money at the grassroots and we need those contracts to survive. This is the real politics of Malaysia and how UMNO party politics have operated for a long time, thriving on the culture of patronage. So the question is Bersatu going to continue this patronage politics? And finally, the GLCs, or in international terms, we call them state-owned enterprises, SOEs. 1MDB would not have happened if SOE governance was well-defined. And the question is, if 1MDB was allowed to happen, could other 1MDBs actually take place? Are there other GLCs under the Ministry of Finance watch that are also undergoing these massive leakages? And interestingly enough, nobody knows the number of GLCs the country actually has, not even the Ministry of Finance. So we don't know whether there's any review that's taking place, and that the government has been silent on the matter. So I turn to the third area, which is in the social, political, or identity politics sector, which is the most perhaps interesting and also most disturbing. While the government was busy trying to do institutional reforms, we see that those in the rural communities, especially the fishing villages, the plantation workers, express a sense of despair and regret after Pakatan won. This is despite them voting for Pakatan. They did not expect the government to fall. And why is this despair and regret present? Because for so long they had depended on these handouts over the years, so that it was not seen any longer as a form of corruption, but as a form of survival. This is essentially the way of life. And the common perception, combined with other things that the government has done over the last year, you might think it's a bit of a joke, but with a smoking ban in eateries, they are unhappy. Civil servants are reduced in size. There's subsidies that are halved, which affect the poorest communities the worst. And you have non-Malays appointed into key positions like the Minister of Finance and the Attorney General. It contributes to the perception that the Malay welfare is not being taken care of. And remember that the Malay forming the majority of the country actually only gave about 30 to 40% support to the new government. This came to a head when over the last year the government tried to ratify two international conventions. One was the ICERT, International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So in the region, only Malaysia and Brunei and Myanmar have not signed it. The second one is the Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, which makes criminal massive war crimes like genocide, war crimes. The government wanted to ratify this, but had to backtrack in both instances because the perception was that the majority Malay special privileges and special position in the constitution would be affected. The people went to the ground, they had big rallies, and they said that, we're not racist, but we just want to uphold the constitution and the special position that we have. This is the perception game, which unfortunately the Pakatan government is failing in some respects. I need to rush a little bit. So what have they done to respond to this? So you can actually see that from December last year, that was a turning point in the new government's reactions to policy making. While they were trying to do institutional reforms in the first half of their term, first half of the year, now they have responded to do things like targeting issues that are specific to the Malay Muslim community. So they revealed corruption in these two big institutions that are meant to be helping Malay Muslims. They They've increased allocations to the rural states. The states in the East Coast, which are largely Malay, you've got projects there, and the government has essentially acceded to some of their demands. The last part, I'm just going to talk about 3 trends that we see moving ahead, and then I'll do a conclusion. So first is that it's a very interesting time for Malaysia where you have new relationships between the federal and the state governments. The federal government has to negotiate with the states, particularly in Johor, in the southern tip of the peninsula, because they have been quite actively critical of the government, especially the rulers, the monarchy. Some states are calling for decentralization and local council elections. The second trend is that social conservatism trumps liberal democratic values. Issues of LGBT and unveiling the hijab are being investigated. The police reform calls are met with internal protests. The past Islamic Party actually said and warned that if Malaysia is taken over by infidels, basically non-Muslims, the Muslims will suffer an Uyghur-like fate. Like in China, we are not allowed to fast. Of course, China has responded as well, saying that, oh no, we treat everyone equally. And finally, the racial quotas in universities have had to be maintained. They had to backtrack as well. So that's the second trend. The third is still economic. I think in many countries in Southeast Asia, ultimately people care about their pockets, whether they're filled. So you're talking about, is the government able to provide new job opportunities, provide housing for the bottom 40, increase their wages? And the sort of liberalization pace is also taking place at a really slow rate. We don't think that Malaysia is being committed to sign on to the CPTPP, which is the new rehash of the TPPA. It might sign on to the RCEP, but many of these reforms will take a long time because the local industry is trying to protest under the name of protectionism. These are my last few slides. I hope to end on the dot. These are the constraints. So you see a coalition that has come into power under very colorful terms, wanting to do a lot of things for what they call as New Malaysia, or Malaysia Baharu. But they're constrained by new and inexperienced ministers. You've got a practically new cabinet that had only been used to being in opposition and being on the streets. And in fact, last night, interestingly, we have a deputy minister holding a press conference against another minister, which is very unusual. I mean, normally they would discuss this in the cabinet. The civil service has been known to sabotage the government. I'll elaborate perhaps in the Q&A. We don't have a two-third majority, as I told you. It's a new coalition. Mahathir is 94, and so what's the transition like? He has actually said he's working harder this time than he ever did in the last time when he was Prime Minister. So imagine that, he's still traveling quite a lot. Ethno-religious politics I've already talked about. Just give me one more minute. So we have some positive developments. Not everything is falling apart. So the US is returning $200 million in 1MDB funds to Malaysia. Singapore is as well, some amount of money. We're doing pretty well in terms of media freedom. We've jumped up the rankings of the World Press Freedom Index. And the renegotiations of contracts have saved us over 40 billion ringgit. So these are some positive developments, which wouldn't have happened if not for the change of government. And finally, the transition of power. Who is next? So you've got Mahathir in the middle. You've got Anwar Ibrahim on the right, who is the former Deputy Prime Minister, slated to be the next Prime Minister, but at the same time, Azmin Ali on the left. They're both from the same party, and there are internal tensions within the party, and the question is who will be given the rein. Just a concluding slide. I don't have time to expand on it, but essentially identity politics will continue in the new Malaysia. Malay votes are split, so you might see a realigning of political parties and coalitions, not just in the next GE, but even in the next few years, perhaps. I think what's happening is that the communication is poor. The new government has not been able to provide a compelling story, a narrative that outlines what it intends to do for the future of the country. You've got good initiatives here and there, but not in a cohesive manner. People voted for different reasons. Not everyone voted because they wanted reform. And I think the government's trying to appease both sides, but they're failing. We have to remember that the society is still largely conservative. It still values political stability and tradition, which was epitomized by Mahathir. He has, to his credit, remained true to the rule of law, but I think we can conclude that we are seeing both a new and old Malaysia, and we'll have to observe in the next year what happens, especially the promise to transition. And if it's true that Anwar is to take over within 2 years, you're looking at a date of May 2020, which is a year from now, not very long. But the sentiment is that people are unsure whether this transition is going to take place in a smooth manner. I will conclude with that and take some questions. Terima kasih.
Well, thanks very much, Tricia, for a very lively start to our day today. We've got some good time for questions. Can I ask that you don't give a speech? You do ask a question and contain yourself to one, because I'm sure there'll be a number of questions from the audience. We'll start with you, Tom.
Hello, thank you. So just a quick question about commenting on the because on Sabah Sarawak, because the previous two GEs without Sabah Sarawak, Barisan Nasional wouldn't have a majority. So we comment a bit about Sabah Sarawak. Thank you.
Sure. So that was on my slide on the first trend on federalism on the rise. So recently, Parliament actually went to vote for an amendment to the Constitution, which would restore the position of Sabah and Sarawak to its previous position, being equal to the peninsula and not equal to the rest of the states. This requires a little bit of historical knowledge of Malaysia. Sabah and Sarawak, yes, you are right, has always been a large voting bank for UMNO, which is why now that many of the members of Parliament left, UMNO's left with very few MPs. The Parliament vote failed. This just happened like a month ago. And because of that, I think Sabah and Sarawak parties are actually feeling once again that they are like the stepchildren of Malaysia. And there are some calls for secession. They're not serious enough to warrant us expecting that it will happen anytime soon. But I think those calls are being translated to the federal government needing to make some economic and political concessions to both of the states. One of the big things is actually on oil royalty. So Sabah and Sarawak on the east coast are oil producing states, as well as Kelantan and Terengganu in the east coast of the peninsula. And they have called for a royalty increase from 5% to 20%, which, if anyone understands oil politics and the way production sharing contracts are managed, that's not possible for the international oil companies to invest in the country. But all the same, perhaps what is sufficient to conclude is that Sabah and Sarawak will be demanding more and more from the federal government, and federal government has actually committed to ensuring it restores the spirit of federalism, upholding what's called the Malaysia Agreement 1963, when Sabah and Sarawak formed Malaysia together with the peninsula. So these are definitely trends that we have to take note of. For now, you have a state government in Sabah that is friendly to Pakatan, but they're also playing this negotiation game where we're friendly to you, we support you, but also ensure that our rights are met.
Okay, you might take another question.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and comprehensive presentation. I'd be interested to know a bit more about what the improved media freedom looks like on the ground, what it's enabling people to do. And the second question is, what interest and involvement is there of Chinese media, particularly in Chinese language media outlets? Mainland Chinese influence, I guess, in Chinese language media.
Okay, so the first question on what the freedoms look like on the ground. The first most evident one is actually the freedom of the press. So as I talked about earlier, it's jumped up the rankings, but in reality as well, we do feel that. So the media is free to report whatever it wants. I think also the sense of fear has abated to a certain extent, But as I mentioned earlier, the society is still largely conservative, which means that issues that touch on social liberal issues like LGBT and the unveiling of the hijab. So the picture that I showed you actually was a book that was written and published recently by a lady who decided to unveil, and she wrote a book about it. And so that's under investigation. So you're talking about perhaps a small minority of those within the very liberal, perhaps urban elite that will feel that their freedoms are still stifled, and they are questioning what's the difference then between the old and the new government. But if you do not encroach upon this particular corner, then in other areas, I think people largely feel a sense of freedom from the previous regime. The second question on China in Chinese press. So first you have to understand that Malaysia media is very heterogeneous in the sense that we have Malay medium, Chinese and English speaking newspapers and TV and radio and so on. I unfortunately don't read Chinese, even though I'm Chinese myself. But I think maybe I can answer that by saying that the Chinese community in Malaysia, the business sector particularly, has been quite open to China, mainland Chinese coming in, and they see this as a way to ensure that their identities are also upheld within Malaysia. But this is not consistent across the board. So you do have some Chinese who feel unconnected to mainland China and would feel more Malaysian in identity. But this goes back to the identity politics, and it's really difficult because Malaysia is just so heterogeneous, and it's difficult to put races in a box. I talked a lot about the Malays as well in my presentation, but we also have to remember that they are not homogeneous either.
Thank you. I have a quick question on how civil service reform that Mahathir government has undertaken affects the government credibility. I mean, in what way that reform affects government credibility, or if it's, I don't know, if it's affects on the government functioning that you mentioned. Thank you.
So civil service, it's in Malaysia we have about 1.6 million civil servants, and the ratio of civil service to the population is one of the highest in Asia Pacific. For many years, even the previous government was not able to reduce the size of the bloated civil service because it's a political endgame. What Mahathir did when he came in was to actually abolish some of the key civil service bodies, like the agencies that sat in the Prime Minister's department, that were actually doing political work. So he took all of these agencies away. What happened then was you had all these messages being sent on WhatsApp and on social media saying that civil service is going to be reduced. So it has had some political backlash. But your question is specific to reform. The short answer is that I don't think the reform is actually taking place yet. And that's because they have not been able to build sufficient trust with the civil service. We have to remember that this civil service has been with UMNO for more than 50 years. It's the same experience that the new governments experienced at the state government level in Selangor and Penang and Perak when they came in. You had documents being leaked. I know I was there, and documents, things that were discussed within closed doors that the next day would come out in the news. So I think this is just an experience that will take time. Perhaps 1 year is really too short for the trust building to take place. So I think reforms will not be taking place so soon, because first you need to solve the problem of the senior civil servants not sabotaging decisions made by ministers and the Prime Minister.
Okay, we've got a final question over here.
Do you think that Pakistan will be able to balance these social reforms that they're currently trying to push through whilst holding on to maybe Bhushan-like policy in the future?
They've tried very hard, and in fact, both the Prime Minister and his senior economic advisor, Daim, who has helped him to negotiate on all these large contracts, they have actually been very, very open and public about saying that we want to do many things. And Zaim, in fact, he's a little bit crude and blunt. He said that, oh, some of the Malays are stupid and you have to wake up. That's the kind of impression that we get. But they have also said that they're operating under constraints. So I think the reality is that moving forward, unfortunately, identity politics has actually deepened. Malaysia has always operated under this shadow of different political parties politicizing race and religion for their own benefit. And this shadow, or this wayang, if you would like, those who are familiar with the wayang kulit, has translated into a reality which is going to be very, very difficult to reverse. And this is not just about urban-rural divide. It's not about age, differences. I think even amongst the younger generation, you see signs of them displaying very conservative elements of, the hijab is one of them. Basically, it's a social taboo not to talk about many of these things. So the answer to your question will take a long analysis, but I think in short, Pakatan will have to concede to these things, and the affirmative action policy, which has special position and special quotas for the Bumiputra, will not see an end anytime soon.
Okay, joining once again.